Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick Verno. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on this episode, we're not talking about goal setting. We are actually talking about goal execution. And we're going to do that with Jim Huling, who's one of the authors of the #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller, The 4 Disciplines of Execution. It's one of the best books I think I've ever read in regards to not just goal setting, but I think more important, goal achievement or goal execution. And what I love about this is that it's a simple but powerful model in terms of helping us to really get to where we want to go. And as we enter into 2023, I think this is just a great time to explore this. So let's get into it. Jim, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I will tell you, this book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution, is one of my favorite books, and especially this time of year as we're coming into January 1, because I think there are so many people out there, businesses, individuals included, that are anxious to say, what do I want to be or who do I want to be in 2023? And I think this book nails it. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Well, I love that. Thank you. I'm very honored to be invited, and I'm painfully conscious that I'm following some real celebrities. Your podcast, I think, is one that everybody wants to be on. I'm especially grateful today to get a chance to do it and to talk to you a little bit about this powerful book and these 4 simple ideas.
Yeah, thank you. So the book actually was first published in 2012, but it was revised in 2021. And obviously, we're dealing with a pandemic. I'm curious, first, if we could talk about what are the 4 disciplines, but then as a second part of that, do you think there's been any difference in how these are utilized as a result of the pandemic?
Quite a bit. I'm glad you started with this question. It's a great one. Let's get the first one out of the way. We'll be very efficient because anybody can Google this and learn everything about what are the 4 disciplines. That's the easy part. But to say them very simply, the first one is the discipline of focus. And as painful as it is for high achieving people to accept, all of our study, all of our research, 300,000 teams that we've worked with all over the world proves once again that human beings can really only do one thing at a time with tremendous excellence. In other words, if it's a wildly important outcome you're seeking, you've really got to give that a significant portion of your focus. And even as you're doing that, you also have a life and a job and a family, and maybe you have other things in your life, or you have what we would call your whirlwind. If you're running a team, you have 1,000 things that come up every single day. So in other words, those things all taken together take somewhere between 80 and 90% of your capacity just to sustain the life or the team operation that you've got going. So if you're being really pragmatic, you've only got a little bit of available capacity to do something different. And if that something different matters a whole lot, you've now found the power of this first discipline, which is one thing above the whirlwind is all you can do with real excellence. So that's why we call it the discipline of focus. Discipline 2 is probably the most radical discipline in all the 4 disciplines because it is the discipline of leverage. We chose that word carefully because it implies that you put in a certain amount of energy, but you get out a larger portion of results. Yeah. So in other words, it's like a stock on the way up. You're making a good investment. So for discipline 2, you find the 1 or 2 most effective, most predictive and influenceable actions that are the true drivers of the goal you're trying to achieve. And Patrick, the thing that's so painful to everybody about this is, Jim, I know 23 things that would help me achieve the goal. I want to do all of those so I can be really sure to achieve the goal. The truth is, 1, you won't do 23 things. You'll get exhausted somewhere along the way and you'll wish you'd never read this book. Or second, you'll say, wait a minute, but what if these 2 things give me the greatest return on my investment? What if I double down on these 1 or 2 key behaviors or key actions that will drive the outcome I want? So discipline 2, discipline of leverage.
the lead indicator is what you're talking about, but how
Yeah.
much we focus, you talk about simplicity,
Yes, that's
that we
right.
focus on the lag indicator, the other
That's
part of
right.
that. And
That's
to me, I would agree. I think that is, this second discipline is radical, but in such a powerful way.
It truly is. And I'm so glad you said that, honestly, because when I meet a new executive, the first hurdle I have to get over is you can only do one thing above your day to day with real excellence. And second, you'll never do it unless you get really smart about what drives that out. Even in a setting like a healthcare setting, for example, one of the most common outcomes everybody wants is a patient experience. Every hospital in the world wants to have a great patient experience, mostly because no patient in the world is qualified to clinically judge the level of care they receive. So they judge based on the experience that they had. So it drives a lot of things in the right direction in the hospital. Okay, then how are we going to do that, boss? 73 ways. No, we'll never do 73 things. We have to ask an intelligent question. If I'm leading a nursing team, what are the one or two things that if we do them really well, will have a disproportionate effect on the outcome we want, which is patient experience. So just a quick example.
Yeah.
So that's discipline 2. And if you're doing shorthand, you could say discipline 1 is like, what are we doing? And discipline 2 is like, how are we going to do it? And that brings us really to discipline 3. And I don't mind saying this, although I think there are people who wish I wouldn't. Discipline 3 is my favorite discipline. It's like having 4 kids and saying, but this is the special one. So I've always loved discipline 3. And discipline 3 is the discipline of engagement. So in other words, if you know what you want to do and you know how you're going to do it, the only thing you've got left is the thing that gets you up every day to go and do it, the wanting to do it. And that's what I love about discipline 3. It engages people to feel that they're doing something meaningful and that they're winning at what they're doing. In a shorthand way, Patrick, all I can say about all the work I do with leaders everywhere who are all excellent and working really hard is that these two things usually go neglected in almost every organization or almost every person who's trying to do something personally. Is, do I have a strong sense of why I'm doing it? And do I have any feeling at all that I'm actually winning at what I'm doing? Discipline 3, the discipline of engagement. We teach a lot of ways to drive that kind of connection to meaning and engagement.
Just along those lines, because I would agree, I think it's so powerful, this, right, the scoreboard, as it gets called sometimes, the simplicity of it is keeping it simple. And I think that's counterintuitive for people at times. They're like, if it's simple, keep it good. But it is.
You and I don't want the listeners of this podcast to see the scoreboards you and I designed 20 years ago. We don't want anybody to see those. Because I know my inclination when I design a scoreboard is I want everything in the world on it. I want it right there where I can see it. And it ends up looking like the console of a 747. It's impressive, but you can't fly it. And what really happens is on a powerful scoreboard, the first characteristic is simplicity. And without that, nobody reads it anyway, much less being motivated by it. One thing, though, if you'll allow me to squeeze it in here, and I know time is important today. One thing I like to always say to people who might be hearing this for the first time, you obviously are a very careful student of 4DX. Remember that the scoreboard is simply a vehicle for getting the team or yourself to take ownership of the outcome. In other words, if the scoreboard is compelling enough, you get excited and you start wanting to win the game. Just like if you're watching football these days, we watch on Saturday and Sunday this time of the year. What if they took the scoreboard down and they just said, hey, enjoy the game just for the sake of the game? We would all go get a hot dog. We wouldn't care. So the scoreboard is critical. But remember, the scoreboard is simply a vehicle for enabling you or a team you're leading to have a sense of ownership and winning about the thing you're trying to do. And then last of all, accountability. I got a feeling you're going to have something great to say about this too, because I'm already mightily impressed with your knowledge of 4DX. Thank you. But it's really important for people hearing this is to know discipline 4, discipline of accountability, is the most important discipline. No question. Because at the end of the day, 1, 2, and 3 are really just a brilliant game plan. But discipline 4 is the game. It's getting on the field and running and throwing and catching. Discipline 4 is this way of mechanizing, in a sense, doing what you said you would do. Now, I don't want it to go a long time on this, and I know you don't want me to, but here's a really quick visual for anybody who might be driving their car listening to you and me today. If you're leading a team of people, imagine them sitting around a table, and you and everybody on your team simply saying every single week, hey, here are the 2 most important things I'm going to do in the coming week to help us achieve our goal. And you said it out loud. You said it to everybody. Yeah. And the next person said theirs, and the next person said theirs. And then 7 days later, you all came back together. You all sat around the same table. If you're like most humans, you sat in exactly the same seat you were in last week. But you had to say, last week I committed to do this and this. And then you have to say out loud, and I did it, or I didn't. And either way, you have strengthened the muscle of accountability. In other words, if you have a team, you've made yourself not just accountable to your boss, but you've made yourselves accountable to each other. And then every time you follow through, you prove something to everybody who works with you about how you can be depended on. So those four things, focus, leverage, engagement, and accountability, are the powerful but simple ideas around which these two fine books have been written.
Yeah. And I love that last one, because to me, that accountability, it's about ownership. Everybody owns what the commitments are. And to me, what's interesting about that, Jim, and I would agree, right? The first three are, to me, those are the intellectual components of this. Yes. And the fourth one, it's like you set your own workout that we were talking about before this call, right? The 68. Intellectually, if you just read the 68 every day, but never went to the gym and actually performed them, intellectually, you know how to do the 68, but I don't think any of us would be surprised if 2 months from now we got back together and you weren't any stronger, any better shape. Intellectually, you knew them, but you didn't do them. And again, I think that's what the fourth discipline here really provides, is the opportunity of going to the gym. This is not intellectual anymore. This is actually doing the work.
Gosh, that's brilliantly said. And I'll finish maybe that thought by quoting an old mentor of mine used to say, there's only so much you can know about swimming until you get wet. The same idea, right? So 1, 2, and 3, you can understand intellectually, you can build a beautiful scoreboard, you can have powerful lead measures that drive your outcome. But until you get in the business of doing it and following through with real credibility, you're not really swimming. You just know some things about swimming.
Yeah. And along those lines, I once heard somebody say that person has a lot of potential. And what they meant by it was they haven't done anything yet.
That's right.
Oh, wow. I don't want to be told I've got a lot of potential. And
I now think I don't either, although I may have been called that at times. I don't think I want that anymore.
So as we transition, before we started this call, both of us spoke about the experience that we've had in healthcare, and you've been in it intimately because your family was in the healthcare field. And I think this is an area that could benefit so much from this model in so many different ways. And I was wondering if we really could explore that component.
I love that. I love that. Special place in my heart is my mom was a hospital COO. And as a teenager, all the conversations around the dinner table were about what happened in the hospital today. And if you experience that, you end up knowing things you wish you didn't know sometimes when you have to go to them. What you come away with is an understanding that these are people who are deeply committed to their work. In so many organizations, the single greatest challenge my coaching clients talk to me about is apathy and disengagement. It's just hard to have people who really care. You don't find that much in healthcare. First of all, nobody goes into healthcare for the money, and nobody goes into healthcare for the short hours or the easy workload. And every single day they meet people at their most vulnerable and hopefully provide healing, not only physically, but maybe emotionally and mentally as well. So I could talk all day about my respect for people in that field, but you wouldn't think an organization in the healthcare arena needs the four disciplines, or many people, you probably would, but many people might not. But I'll just say this, just imagine your day in a hospital. Do you think anybody has a whirlwind like healthcare people do?
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, Paul, if you and I miss an assignment or we're late on a report or we fail to close a deal, we say, "Aw, shucks," and we go on to the next one. But people in the healthcare field are very often dealing with life and death or well-being versus the absence of well-being. The stakes are high. Four disciplines as a way of getting something done or going to a new level while you are incredibly challenged by your day-to-day whirlwind is a tool maybe more valuable in the hands of healthcare people than any other industry. I don't know, but I think the argument could certainly be made.
Yeah. And I think along the lines, especially of an industry that is experiencing such a shortage of labor, yet the demands aren't being reduced. Tremendous. The demands are increasing. That's right. To me, a model like this provides an opportunity to really zero in on how we're going to be most effective with the resources we have available to us to meet our goals.
Right. That's exactly right. And if you'd like to talk about it for a moment, the healthcare environment, 4DX really starts the same way it does in any other organization by asking this profoundly simple question. What is the single most important outcome we could achieve this year that we won't achieve without a new level of discipline and focus? What would that be? And sometimes in a healthcare organization, it's about growth or expansion or about the financial health of the organization. But most of the time, you'd be pleased to know, of all the hospitals I've worked with, which is quite a large number now, they most often choose the experience of the patient because they know that They can probably get the clinical side right. They have lots of ways of doing that and lots of checks and balances. But the human side of helping a person get well is something that requires more art, and it's often overlooked. So that's the place where most hospitals start with 4DX is what is our wildly important goal? And most often they choose patient experience.
So Jim, along those lines, I'd be curious your thoughts. And there's a lot of research out there in regards to the impact that employee engagement, staff engagement has on patient safety and patient outcomes. How have you experienced that in terms of rolling that into this model?
Yeah, I love that question. You remind me for a moment, another of my biggest clients, which was the Marriott Corporation, where the message lives out every day. We take great care of our people and our people take great care of our guests. I think that rolls right into the healthcare world, that there's fundamentally in a hospital, the better care you take of your team, particularly your nursing team, who's often one of the most challenged, the better care they feel empowered and inspired to offer to the patients they serve. And I would want to be quick to say every nurse I've ever known gives the greatest care they're capable of, no matter what their boss does. But still, it's a factor that comes in. But let's just say this plainly. They live in a world where everything is urgent. And everything is pulling them in 1,000 different directions every day. And they have forms to fill out and metrics to track and call buttons to respond to. So when you try to execute on something in a world like that, where life and death could be at play, you can hardly imagine a more pressurized situation. And yet, 4DX has been unbelievably successful in healthcare for the very reasons I've said. In other words, the argument can be reversed to say, in an environment like that, where would you need focus more? Where would you need the clarity of a single goal that's designated as more important than all the other goals? If you're not sure what to do in the next moment, it's like a lighthouse on a hill. We will always know what's most important. How powerful would that be in an environment as challenging and frenetic sometimes as a hospital? And then the second thing, if you don't mind me adding real quickly, is, and then imagine you had that goal and you're a nurse and you're sitting there saying, when am I ever going to have time to do this? How do I have time to do this? You want me to do something new? I'm already doing the best that I can. But if you could say, we're not necessarily going to ask for any extra time or energy. We simply want you to concentrate some energy into a couple of things that will actually give you more of the result you want than if you did 20 other things. We're going to teach you how to, as we say, find your leverage by getting smart about the actions that drive the outcome that you want. I hope I've made a good argument that 4DX and healthcare were born for each other.
Yeah, and you make a great point there in terms of the nurse that says, I can't add one more thing to my plate. I barely have the bandwidth to do what I'm doing right now, or nurse manager. What do you think are some of the challenges or some of the things that to be aware of as a hospital or a medical practice tries to identify a goal, a wildly important goal?
It's a great question, honestly. And I think challenge number one, which I've touched on for a moment, I'll go to challenge number two, but challenge number one is just simply the same challenge everybody has, Patrick. When I first come into an organization, it's not unusual for a hospital CEO to say to me, Jim, we're so glad to have you here today. We're interested in 4DX, but I just want to tell you before we start, we may not need this. We are great at executing. We're just great at it. And I'm not being a cynic. There's some humor in this. But the moment that's said to me, I know what I'm about to see. And so I'll say, oh, great. Maybe I should get the first plane back home because you're not going to need me. But before I go, could I just see your goals? Could you tell me, what are your goals for this year? What are the things you're really driving? And with real pride, a person will say, oh, I'd love to show them to you. We have 17 of them. And here they are. And I know I'm the right person in the right place. I was supposed to be here today because I can help you, but they don't know they need my help yet. And then even if I say, gosh, 17, wow, that's impressive. If you had to say, which one would you say is the most important of those 17? And then there is this cemetery-like silence. I don't know. I don't know which one we would say was the most important. And there is where my work usually can begin, to make the case. We can do all 17 of them. And I'm not saying you can't. But I am saying if you're going to do them well, you better do them one at a time. You better focus on one thing with real excellence, like an air traffic controller landing a plane, that kind of intensity. Focus on one of those at a time. And by the end of the year, you may have hit all 17 of them. I don't know. Depends on what they are, of course. But you can do just about anything, but you'll never get any of them done if you try to approach them all at once as though they were all priority one.
Yeah.
We all know if everything's priority one, what's really priority one? Nothing. But we forget that in our desire to accomplish a lot.
Yeah. What I also appreciate in this, when we talk about the idea of creating this wildly important goal, is involvement. Who needs to be involved in identifying what this is?
Great question. Great question. And really, you've touched on something maybe we'll get to before our time is up, a little bit of why do we feel we needed a second edition of the Four Disciplines? But your question really goes to the heart of that, is that a lot of organizations are still today run top down in a post-World War II military model, which really served all the countries in the world quite well for many decades. I'm not here to throw stones at that. But I doubt there's a single leader listening to this conversation today who doesn't feel that the time of that model has surely passed.
Yeah.
The Great Resignation and all those things have highlighted that people don't want to work in that way. I have a little bit of pride, I hope it's all right to say, that we've been for the last 10 years preaching a different idea. We've been saying, if you really want to do something spectacular or significant in your organization, you start with top-down direction. You can't just take a vote and say, what does everybody feel like doing this week? You've got to, leaders have to step in and say, we've assessed the situation, and here are maybe the three things that we think are most critical. But then you have to stop and create bottom-up engagement. I don't know if I'm allowed to use my hands in a podcast. Top-down direction combined with bottom-up engagement. That place where those two forces meet is the most powerful fusion of anything I've ever seen in 40 years of leadership in my life. But we don't all have that message yet. I meet leaders every day who are simply saying, what we need is more clarity on what people are supposed to do and stronger consequences when they don't do it. And I just want to say, guys, did you just come out of a cave? That model doesn't serve you.
Right.
And you're missing the incredible contribution that 100 people at the front line could tell you. And by the way, nurses know a lot more about patient care than doctors do because they do a lot more of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no criticism in that. But why wouldn't you build a model where you put the best of those two forces together? And anything that we agree on in that model has got to be something that'll make a real difference.
Yeah. And I know we're focused on healthcare right now, but really that same thing applies to any frontline individual. Generally knows more than the people at the top do about what really needs to happen there. And what you just said, Jim, really, it strikes me again, this model that I've used since 2009. It was created by David Rock, Dr. David Rock, the SCARF model. Right. That some probably get tired of me talking about in the work that I do. But I think this model since COVID has taken on, to me, even more and more importance. And I hear you talking about this bottom up, or where the two meet, that each one of those behaviors or those social needs, status, when people don't feel as though their worth has been appreciated in the environment, if certainty isn't there, if autonomy isn't there, if relatedness, my connection to the organization, and fairness, I think all of those things touch on goal setting here when they're not involved. We can probably make a case for how each one of those things could create an environment where people didn't feel as though that social need was satisfied if they weren't involved in the process of the wildly important goal.
You can make a case that there are many things that follow that step, but you and I are in solid agreement that if you start by, in essence, saying to the people around you, you don't need to think, we'll tell you what to do. Just do exactly what we tell you. Then you're almost irrecoverable. Now, Dr. Covey had a wonderful quote when he said, 4 things you need to remember: no involvement, no commitment. It's a powerful shorthand for, I think, for a lot of things you and I are talking about. And the more we do it that way, the less commitment we actually get. And then now we're seeing a lot of things that are side effects of simply the absence. But if I can squeeze this in, it's something I have a lot of passion about. And you said it in your own words, which I now wish I could have written down. Maybe I'll get you to tell me that after the podcast. But my own personal belief as a leader is every single person I've ever encountered in any organization or led myself is seeking the answer to 2 fundamental questions. Am I doing something that matters? And does anybody care?
Yeah.
And that's not in the book. That's just Jim's shorthand way of talking about things that are in the book. But that's what you're talking about as well, isn't it? Is this just a task, or does this matter? And then second, if I do it well or I do it poorly, does anybody care?
Yeah.
You know, those 2 questions, you got to care about getting people answers to those 2 questions if you want a group to come together and do something.
And I think part of that, and I think you speak to it, is who cares about me? Aside from the work that's being done, who cares about me? Or am I just a cog in the wheel here? I'm just used to get stuff done. Or do you really care about me as an individual? And where in your book you talk about, don't be fooled at the simplicity of this model.
Yes.
I think the same thing can be said for leadership as a whole, that we've overcomplicated this thing. There are very simple things, behaviors that if we demonstrate those consistently, we execute as leaders.
And when you do that, what you just said, first of all, you become a very rare leader still today in the world. Yeah. And what you will find as you do it over time is that your ability to attract talent has expanded exponentially, because there's a literal army of people in the world today searching for leaders who lead like that, who value the performance, but who value the performer in an equal level. That you're not just a cog who filled a slot, and if you're gone, there's plenty more of you out there, which one of my bosses said to me one time, that you do matter to this organization. And your performance matters as well. It's not a dichotomy. There are two things that are fused together. But if you have one and not the other, then really it's just a transactional relationship you have. And then we're all very surprised when people treat it like a transactional relationship and say, hey, I can get $5 an hour more across the street. I'll see you later. Why are we surprised by that? We've set that up to be the case.
Exactly. We've created that. So as we work through from a healthcare perspective, what's been your experience when it relates to that discipline 3? What have you seen in your work that's been effective in terms of keeping people?
Thank you for asking this, Patrick. And you've had the best questions. I don't know if it's appropriate to compliment you on air, but wow, I do a lot of podcasts where I don't see anything like the kind of research you've done to be prepared for this. So I'm deeply honored by how obvious it is that you've done all that. Thank you, my friend. This is an interesting thing. You used the word overcomplicate a moment ago, and I just almost heard a bell ring when you said that, because it's such a great truth. And nowhere do we overcomplicate things more than healthcare, partly because we're so afraid of missing something. We're trying to catch everything. And so it's perhaps an innocent thing. But if you could see, and you saw them in the book perhaps, some of the pictures of scoreboards that a healthcare team will design when they are left alone to design it themselves. There's no corporate design person saying, yes, I've created all the scoreboards and they all look just alike, but here's yours and here's yours. This is where a leader will say to the team, listen, there's only 3 things about the scoreboard that matter, and you can build one as long as it's appropriate, you can build one to have anything you want on it. These teams come back with something that makes the blood leave the face of every leader when they see them. They're like, oh no, I didn't expect this. But what really happens is that people say, hey, this is our board. That we built, this is our board. Yes, it may have quirky humor on it. Yes, we may have decided to call ourselves the healthcare Eagles. I don't know. But I say to every executive, why do you care? As long as it's not inappropriate, if this lights them up, why would you not say, here's another $150, build some other stuff? So in other words, the scoreboard gives people probably the first chance, some of them in their entire career, to say, this is how I would do it. And when it's finished, to say, hey, boss, you're part of our team, but this belongs to us. This is our board. And if anybody listening to us is driving their car or eating a sandwich or whatever, here's the thing I wish you'd take away. When human beings say, this is our scoreboard, they are also saying, this is our score. And so this idea of ownership that you've been talking, you've been to all the seminars, you've read all the books about how to get people to take ownership. I lovingly say, put all that to the side for a moment. It's really pretty simple. When people feel like the score is theirs, they will act like people who own the score. It's not complicated. Now, it's not easy. It takes work. I'm not saying that, but it's not complicated. And it's not over-architected. It's really a simple dynamic that when you do it, produces amazing results.
Yeah, which then leads us right into that 4th discipline around one of the things that you talk about in the book is around cadence. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing from a healthcare perspective, right? Where people are saying, boy, we don't have enough time. We can't have another meeting. How do we implement cadence so that this thing doesn't just become like we got off to a great start, but there was no follow-up with it?
That's right. You and I, before the podcast, had said we're both passionate fans of Patrick Lencioni, which I totally am. And one of my favorite books of his is called Death by Meeting. The title alone, I would buy the book just for the title. I'm glad to know there is a book called Death by Meeting, because I have almost died in a lot of meetings throughout my career, or wished I had died. I don't know. But the idea here is not necessarily to think about the meeting, but to think about the experience of being in the meeting. So, for example, in our system, we limit weekly meetings to 15 minutes. We don't talk about anything but the wildly important goal and what we're doing to achieve it. We don't talk about the day-to-day. We don't talk about parking or the snow in Maine or what they're serving in the lunchroom today. We don't talk about any of those things. We go there, we're in there fast, we get our stuff done. But what every person does is they have that moment of accountability that I described a few minutes ago, which is quite powerful. And if I was going to try to just put a ribbon around that really quickly, I'd say There can't be anybody listening to this broadcast today who doesn't agree that trust and respect are two of the most missing elements in a lot of teams around the world. Trust and respect, two things lots of leaders are trying to drive. And of course, Franklin Covey has an unbelievable book and product from Stephen M. R. Covey, who preceded me as one of your guests. So there's no better book in the world than that. But I'm still saying the problem exists. So in a Discipline 4 meeting, every single person every week says, I said I would do this, and I did it. So again, if you're looking for a simple but effective process, what could be better than 52 times a year, you see everybody on your team say they will do something and then do it? Will your respect for that person go up if 52 weeks in a row they say they'll do something hard or easy and then they get it done? Will your respect for them go up? Will your trust with them? Will you reach a point where you might say, Patrick, listen, if Patrick said he'll do it, I'm going to tell you, you don't even need to follow up. This guy doesn't miss. If he said he'll do it, he'll do it. Well, what happens to a team when you grow trust and respect from the inside out? Not outside in, books and seminars and courses and things. Those are all great. Yeah. But from the inside out, hey, 52 times in the last year, I saw Patrick say he would get something done by next week. And 52 times he stood up and said, I did it. Yeah. What do you mean you don't trust this guy? So you build that kind of characteristic from the inside out. And that's really the most powerful way to do it.
Yeah. And what I love about that is that it talks about it in a way that says, again, from the ownership perspective of, you know what, maybe Patrick didn't deliver this week, but he says, here's what I'm going to do for next week, though. Exactly. Right? Exactly. I'm going to own when I didn't do it.
That's right. And you're always going to say why you didn't do it. And you're going to say, what are you going to do to catch up? Because now you're a step behind where you said you would be. So beautiful accountability built into that. Yeah. And we're touching on some things that we don't have time to really go in here, but around psychological safety, I think that you have in that Discipline 4, when you really have that, man, the things that you can accomplish when people are willing to say, I did it, I didn't, but here's what's going to happen going forward, and people support you. One thing I love about our new friendship is we have the same vocabulary for a lot of powerful things. And if I tried to close that, I would say, I don't think either of us would say leadership is easy, but we would say it's possible for leadership to be simple. It's still incredibly hard. It still takes all the talent you have, and you're giving all you've got every single day, and you hope and pray that everything comes out the way you want, but it's not complicated.
I think that is probably a great place for us to end this part of this conversation, Jim. I don't know what else to say other than that. As a teaser, though, coming up, you do have a book that you're hoping to launch in 2023. And I'd love to maybe, if you're comfortable saying what that book is probably going to be about, and then the invite is to have you on to discuss that as well.
Oh, my goodness. And what I'm so happy about, I just got chill bumps when you said that. First of all, you've publicly obligated yourself to have me back in front of all your listeners. So I'll take that to the bank. And then to say, I'm working on a book right now with a co-author partner, and it's called Find Your Fire. And it's really about what I think is the greatest missing thing in the world today. I love the world I've lived in 4DX, which is about principles and techniques and practices. And I think those have been life-changing for a lot of people. But you can have all the principles and practices in the world, and if you don't have this kind of fire inside you to want to go do them and to want to get better at them and to want it to mean something, then it'll always lack. So I'm trying to fill a need that I think adds to the work I've done for the last 20 years in the 4 disciplines, but it isn't a replacement or a substitute for it. It just simply is additive, but it goes to the heart rather than the mind. Find your fire, 7 steps to regain the inner fire and drive you may have lost.
Love it. I'm definitely looking forward to reading that and having you back on here for that.
Oh, thank you, my friend. Thank you. What an honor it's been to be here. And I just thank you again for the good work you're doing to bring messages like this out to so many people. Thank you.
Thank you for being on and really sharing your great message in the book that you've created. So thank you for that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my podcast. If you found the guests and topics on my show and my perspectives on the show to be valuable to your own personal growth or to the growth of your team, I would love the opportunity to have a discussion with you on how the models, the approaches, and the book that I've published, The Leadership Bridge, How to Engage Your Employees and Drive Organizational Excellence, can help you and your organization as well. If you're interested, you can reach out to me at patrick@emeryleadershipgroup.com, and that's EMERY, leadershipgroup.com. And let's explore how my unique models and approaches can help you and your team or your organization to rise above your best.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.